Thank you.
All right, so we are starting our fourth class on the Kitab-i-Iqan, and we're beginning part 2 of the Iqan, which in a way is an entirely new book. You can almost start the Kitab-i-Iqan with part 2, and the focus, the flow and thread of the conversation changes, although parts 1 and 2 share completely in their purpose, and that both of them have as background the explanation of this problem addressed by the uncle of the Bab as to how to understand scripture that so many have attempted to read out in literal terms, and Baha'u'llah is offering us other angles on the reading of scripture. In part 1, it was through talking about prophecy as something which should be primarily interpreted symbolically, whereas part 2 begins with the prophet, not so much the words of the prophet, but the nature of the prophet, and how the nature of the prophet also needs to be understood symbolically, just as their words need to be understood symbolically. In part 1, just to briefly recap, we see already a huge number of central questions in religion and religious history have been at least touched upon, and entirely, I think, new approaches have begun to be outlined, which we'll see more of in part 2. As we talked about previously, background for these questions is the problem of theodicy, of how and why it is that the will of a God who presumably wants to be known and wants good in the world, how that will seems to be so often subverted by the creatures who are subjects of that will. And Baha'u'llah answers enigmatically in a number of places, something about roses and thorns, something about the structure of creation really requiring a differentiation between roses and thorns, to put it metaphorically. And this connects, I think, to this question of free will and why we have free will. Of course, in the opening paragraphs of part 1 of the Kitab-i-Iqan, it begins with the question of certitude, gives us some glimpses as to the meaning of certitude, which we're going to get into much more in part 2, mentions some of the prerequisites for attaining certitude, which again, we're going to have far more detail on in part 2, and ask this question as to who's responsible for the mess we're in, who's responsible for the rejection of the prophets. And Baha'u'llah's answer in part 1 seems to point the finger at the clergy, but we know elsewhere Baha'u'llah explains that really it's the people and not the clergy. And Abdu'l-Baha tells us in some answer questions that maybe one might apparently be addressed when really the other is intended. And this raises an interesting possibility, and I think a key element of Baha'u'llah's message that we're going to see another example of in part 2 of the Kitab-i-Iqan. And that key element of Baha'u'llah's message is that there are multiple narrative frameworks that can, in their own way, be equally valid. And this comes across in part 1 in connection to this question of responsibility. It comes across particularly in part 2, in book 2, in regard to, as we're going to see right off, outlining different ways in which we understand the divine. And Baha'u'llah is, as he does in part 1, as he does elsewhere in his writings, and in answer to so many questions that he's asked, where he's asked to differentiate between seemingly irreconcilable views of things, and this has happened numerous times throughout Baha'u'llah's ministry. Baha'u'llah rarely, and I can't think of a single instance where Baha'u'llah answers in a way that excludes the other side. When, for example, Baha'u'llah, his followers are in disagreement as to the nature of the prophet, and one of them says, well, the prophet is God, and the other and another of his followers argues, no, the prophet is just a human being. And they ask Baha'u'llah, well, which of these is correct? And Baha'u'llah never says one is right and the other is wrong. He always gives relative validity to both perspectives. And I will argue that this is really key, if not the key, to Baha'u'llah's message, because in a world consisting of such tremendous diversity as it does, diversity of minds, diversity of hearts, diversity of approaches to the divine, Baha'u'llah's solution is not to reduce that diversity to a single path, to a single correct theological formulation. Baha'u'llah's answer, instead, as it is, as we see unfolding in the pages of the Kitab-i-Iqan, is to open the doorways for multiple pathways in, for multiple angles to have their own validity. So we're going to see this right away in part 2 of the Kitab-i-Iqan. Again, we can work as it may be helpful with an outline to these paragraphs, which we're going to cover, which overall have the topic of the sovereignty of the manifestations. But the opening paragraph, just as there's an opening paragraph in part 1 that gives some very key insights, the opening of part 2 of the opening paragraph of part 2 of the Kitab-i-Iqan also gives us a key insight that the prophet, he who is the day star of truth and the revealer of the supreme being, holdeth for all time undisputed sovereignty over all that is in heaven and on earth, though no man be found on earth to obey him. There's a radical separation between whatever reality Baha'u'llah claims for the manifestations and what people acknowledge of that reality on earth. It's possible that not a single person recognizes. That doesn't change the nature of their, what Baha'u'llah calls undisputed sovereignty. Well, clearly some people are disputing this sovereignty. So when Baha'u'llah says that it's undisputed, he can't obviously be talking about the words and the ideas that exist in the world, in the human world. He's talking about a reality which exists on a completely different plane, a symbolic plane, just as the reality of the true meaning of the prophecies that Baha'u'llah unfolds in part 1 also exists undisputably, but in its own symbolic plane. In paragraph 1 of 3, Baha'u'llah explains this assertion by saying the significance and essential purpose underlying these words is to reveal and demonstrate unto the pure in heart and the sanctified in spirit, not those who are thinking logically, but those who are pure in heart, that they who are the luminaries of truth and the mirrors reflecting the light of divine unity in whatever age and cycle they are sent down from their invisible habitations of ancient glory unto this world, to educate the souls of men and endue with grace all created things, are invariably endowed with an all-compelling power and invested with invincible sovereignty. So you'll notice some red boxes here that you might not have seen in part 1. For my own annotation of the Kitab-i-Iqan, I've marked with these red boxes all of the parts of the Iqan that were quoted by Shoghi Effendi in his major letter entitled The Dispensation of Baha'u'llah. And Shoghi Effendi excerpts a few sentences here and there from the Kitab-i-Iqan in the Dispensation of Baha'u'llah. And that letter is such a core exposition for Baha'is of Baha'i theology that it seemed to make sense to me to highlight those, especially highlight those sentences. And there aren't that many of them that Shoghi Effendi himself extracted from the Kitab-i-Iqan, because they seem to They seem to really capture the kernel of the ideas. So the first idea that Baha'u'llah is expressing, and so much of part 2 of the Kitab-i-Iqan, at least this whole section up to paragraph 146, is explaining how this thing can be true, how it can be that they hold this undisputed sovereignty over all things when really there's no one there to acknowledge that sovereignty. But to get to that point, he first of all makes some assertions and sets the scene as to what kind of beings these prophets are, these manifestations are. And in doing so, it's helpful to keep in the back of our mind 3 different degrees or stages that he can be speaking on. And this idea of there being 3 degrees of how one can view the divine is brought out even more explicitly in a later section of part 2, which we're going to be looking at probably next week or the week after that. But we already see it in its first realization here in these couple of pages. And the 3 degrees are as follows. The first degree is in paragraph 104. To every discerning and illumined heart, it is evident that God, the unknowable essence, the divine being, is immensely exalted beyond every human attribute, such as corporeal existence, ascent and descent, egress and regress. So the idea of this reality incarnating itself is not possible. He is and hath ever been veiled in the ancient eternity of his essence and will remain in his reality everlastingly, hidden from the sight of men. He quotes from one of from the Quran. He standeth exalted beyond and above all separation and union, all proximity and remoteness. So it's a strange kind of description of a God which seems unutterably remote, completely transcendent, completely other, but Baha'u'llah at the same time is saying that at this level, God actually transcends the whole concept of otherness. So it's an otherness which is even beyond otherness. It is an absolute oneness which is even beyond the concept of oneness. It's an absolute existence which is even beyond the concept of existence, because any attribute that we think that we can assign to God, believing that that attribute is very fundamental, that, for example, existence, we want to say that God exists. We think, okay, if there's anything we can say about God, we can say God exists. But even the existence of God is an attribute. And God at this level of the essence, paragraph 104, is beyond any attribute that we can imagine. So also beyond the attribute of oneness, even beyond the attribute of existence. Some Christian theologians have also, this is not unique to Baha'u'llah's writings. One finds this idea of absolute transcendence that transcends the concept of transcendent in the work of other writers, of other faith traditions, particularly mystical faith traditions of the East and of the West. And so it's not surprising to see it here. One example of a Christian theologian, Paul Tillich, who talks about this, he talks about God as the ground of all being, not being itself, not existence itself, but something which somehow grounds being, but not in a sense that trends towards, pantheism or something like that. So there's this idea expressed in paragraph 104 of an utterly transcendent God. So how do we get then to prophets? How then do we get to a world which somehow has knowledge of this divinity, which is so far beyond everything? And that so far beyond everything is further underlined in paragraph 105. If God was alone, there was none else beside him. All the prophets of God and their chosen ones, all the divines, the sages, the wise of every generation, unanimously recognize their inability to attain unto the comprehension of that quintessence of all truth, and confess their incapacity to grasp him who is the inmost reality of all things, kind of like the ground of being almost. So in the face of this utter transcendence, we have
Stephen, can I
the
just
need
say
for
something?
connection. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. Can I just say one quick thing about Paul
Yes.
Tillich?
Yes.
The other idea I think he was getting at with the ground of all being was getting away from God as something in the sky, and
Yes.
getting away from God as Sky Daddy,
Mhm.
up there, Heavenly Father, but the
Mhm.
ground of all being, thinking about, being grounded in God and God spreading out under our feet is
Mhm.
it also works just in terms of ground, and kind of,
Yes.
again, trying to turn on its head that old definition of God. Thanks.
Yes, and we're going to see Baha'u'llah give kind of his version of that God as grounded being in just a couple more paragraphs. It'll be what is kind of the third stage of the divinity, so to speak. If the first stage is the utterly transcendent divinity, the second stage is the divinity manifested in the world through the vehicle of a chosen receptacle, and that's paragraph 106. The door of the knowledge of the Ancient of Days, being thus closed in the face of all beings. The source of infinite grace hath caused those luminous gems of holiness to appear out of the realm of the spirit in the noble form of the human temple, and be made manifest unto all men, that they may impart unto the world the mysteries of the unchangeable being, and tell of the subtleties of his imperishable essence. These sanctified mirrors, these day springs of ancient glory, are one and all the exponents on earth of him who is the central orb of the universe, its essence and ultimate purpose. From him proceed their knowledge and power. From him, God, is derived their sovereignty. The beauty of their countenance is but a reflection of his image, and their revelation a sign of his deathless glory. They are the treasuries of divine knowledge and the repositories of celestial wisdom. Through them is transmitted a grace that is infinite, and by them is revealed the light that can never fade. So there is a connection between the what is above, so to speak, and what is below, although God is not above, as Paul Tillich wanted to emphasize. It's not the God in the sky somewhere, but beyond that, utterly transcendent. To connect the utterly transcendent with this world, that principle of connection is manifested through the reality of the prophet. So paragraph 106, in a way, then is the quintessential kind of ground zero statement in the Baha'i writings, as far as I've seen, that most clearly says this is what a prophet is. They are the sort of the signpost in this world of a reality which is otherwise utterly transcendent. But there's a third station, and that third station is the world itself, is the divinity manifested not just in a single person historically in time, at some rare intervals, but a divinity which shines within every atom, which is manifested within every drop. And Baha'u'llah turns to that third degree in paragraph 107. He says, whatever is in the heavens and whatever is on the earth is a direct evidence of the revelation within it of the attributes and names of God, inasmuch as within every atom are enshrined the signs that bear eloquent testimony to the revelation of that most great light. Methinks but for the potency of that revelation, no being could ever exist. How resplendent the luminaries of knowledge that shine in an atom, and how vast the oceans of wisdom that surge within a drop. So that the rays of that divine sun are not confined to these particular beings, but they are spread out through all creation. So that's kind of the bottom level, in a way, is that revelation of the divinity through all things. Then Baha'u'llah says, to a supreme degree is this true of man, who among all created things hath been invested with the robe of such gifts, and hath been singled out for the glory of such distinction. So in him, in humanity, are potentially revealed all the attributes and names of God to a degree that no other created being hath excelled or surpassed. Of course, on this planet, I mean, Baha'u'llah is not, we don't expect Baha'u'llah to get all cosmic on us, but we do know that all of this has to be taken within the context of time and place and context. And we know elsewhere in the Baha'i writings that this principle of consciousness reaching this degree of self-consciousness and ability to reflect upon its creation is not confined to this planet in the universe, but probably certainly exists elsewhere. To what degree of frequency and so forth, open question. But on this planet anyway, the highest degree of that, the most intense focus of those rays of the divine sun are found within us. And then beautiful quotations about the human reality being in some way the locus of all the names and attributes of God. But then beyond that of all men, and I'm skipping forward just to sort of to draw it all together. In paragraph 109 towards the end, he says, and of all men, the most accomplished, the most distinguished, and the most excellent are the manifestations of the Son of Truth. So there's a kind of hierarchy, there's a kind of a pyramid of, divinity within all things, but most perfectly expressed within the human reality, and among the human reality, most perfectly expressed within those manifestations of the Son of Truth. So, but first of all, Baha'u'llah re-emphasizes this pervasiveness of the divine bounty in paragraph 109, when he says that all things in their inmost reality testify to the revelation of the names and attributes of God within them, each according to its capacity, indicated and is expressive of the knowledge of God, so potent and universal is this revelation, that it hath encompassed all things visible and invisible. And then, of course, it says that the highest expression of that are the manifestation of the Son of Truth, and that all else besides these manifestations live by the operation of their will and move and have their being through the outpourings of their grace. Human tongue can never befittingly sing their praise, and human speech can never unfold their mystery. These tabernacles of holiness, these primal mirrors which reflect the light of unfading glory, are but expressions of him who is the invisible of the invisibles. By the revelation of these gems of divine virtue, all the names and attributes of God, such as knowledge and power, sovereignty and dominion, mercy and wisdom, glory, bounty, and grace, are made manifest. And then, very crucially, Baha'u'llah doesn't confine these names and attributes to a particular manifestation, but gives kind of equal importance to all of these manifestations of divine truth, which is the key requirement for Baha'u'llah's project in the world, which is to bring together all of the faith traditions of the world into harmony. And you can't do that by saying, well, this prophet was greater than the other prophet, or this prophet shone brighter than that prophet. They all have to be in some ontological sense at an equal level. And Baha'u'llah makes this point in paragraph 110, that these attributes of God are not and have never been vouchsafed specially unto certain prophets and withheld from others. Nay, all the prophets of God, his well-favored, his holy, and chosen messengers, are without exception the bearers of his names and the embodiments of his attributes. They differ only in the intensity of their revelation and the comparative potency of their light, but that intensity and comparative potency is not an intrinsic function of those prophets. It's a function of the age and receptivity of the people to which they were sent from age to age. Baha'u'llah makes that very, very clear elsewhere. He says it also here, that later in this paragraph, that a certain attribute of God hath not been outwardly manifested by these essences of detachment, doth in no wise imply that they who are the day springs of God's attributes and the treasuries of his holy names did not actually possess it. What he doesn't say here explicitly, but he does say elsewhere explicitly, is that differentiation is a feature of time and place. One could perhaps, just as an example, say the message of Jesus is so clearly a message of love, and one doesn't see that message of love as clearly expressed in the Quran. The Quran seems to be more a message of justice. It seems to be more a message of, one might say, well, it seems that Jesus is a prophet of love and Muhammad is more a prophet of justice. But I think Baha'u'llah would say that this apparent difference, the difference between them is not that one of them was more intrinsically loving than the other, but perhaps more that Muhammad came to a time and a place in the world that required a different kind of outpouring of the divine attributes. So that's the first 11 or 12 paragraphs up to paragraph 112 then of this section deals with this sort of setting out the theological ground of the prophets as mediators, of their essential equality with each other, and the fact that the divine light can be found not exclusively in the prophets, but really in all things in the world. Then he turns to paragraph 113. And now to resume our argument concerning the question. Why is it that the sovereignty of the Qa'im, the promised one of the Quran, affirmed in the text of recorded traditions and handed down by the shining stars of the Mohammedan dispensation, hath not in the least been made manifest? Nay, the contrary hath come to pass. Hath not his disciples and companions been afflicted of men? Are they not still the victims of the fierce opposition of their enemies? Are they not today leading the life of abased and impotent mortals? Yea, the sovereignty attributed to the Qa'im and spoken of the scriptures is a reality, the truth of which none can doubt. This sovereignty, however, is not the sovereignty which the minds of men have falsely imagined. It's something else. And that sovereignty is something which is visible only to the eyes of those who are pure in heart. He explains in paragraph 114, that sovereignty is the spiritual ascendancy which he exercises to the fullest degree over all that is in heaven and on earth, and which in due time revealeth itself to the world in direct proportion to its capacity and spiritual receptiveness. Even as the sovereignty of Muhammad, the messenger of God, is today apparent and manifest amongst the people. And so he gives a fair bit of space to then explaining to the uncle of the Bab, something the uncle of the Bab would already be aware of and would already acknowledge, that Muhammad himself in the early years of his ministry did not possess temporal sovereignty, that Muhammad himself was afflicted by various trials, and that the sovereignty of Muhammad became manifest in this physical plane only sometime later. The obvious implication being, look at the case of the Bab. Even though the Bab spent his whole short, brief ministry of 6 years in various states of semi-exile and imprisonment, with no sovereignty to speak of, that similarly, this sovereignty of the Bab is something which also will inevitably become manifested in the world at a later point. So he spends a few paragraphs talking about this point about the trials that were inflicted upon Muhammad and his outward lack of earthly sovereignty. But then says in paragraph 117, look now, eventually it will become manifest. One simply has to be able to look at at the thing with by being able to take enough steps back and look at the whole evolution of it over time, which one, of course, doesn't have the luxury of when one is sitting right on top of the genesis of a new faith, of a new prophet. The implication also being it's really tough to be there in the opening years of any prophetic revelation, because you have the prophet making all sorts of claims, which may seem quite outrageous or quite, quite beyond what they may seem capable of. And you don't have the benefit of what all other religious faiths have the benefit of, which is seeing the fruits that came out of it during the course of the succeeding centuries. What one has in those years of the Advent, immediately following the advent of a faith, is you have much less data points to connect. And the same thing is true. It was true of Baha'u'llah talking about the cause of the Bab back here in 1861 or 1862. It's, I think, equally true of the Baha'i Faith today. One can't say, well, look at the sovereignty of that it's exerted. Look at the world order that has been created. One has to see it with other eyes to recognize the thing in its potentiality, as it has not yet become manifested. But regarding this inevitable sovereignty of Muhammad, he says, this sovereignty must needs be revealed and established either in the lifetime of every manifestation of God, as it became partially during the lifetime of Muhammad. By the end of his life, Islam had already begun its inexorable expansion, which lasted some centuries after Muhammad's death. But during Muhammad's own lifetime, some of the earthly fruits of that sovereignty, which as cast through the lens of Western history, looks like the conquest of religion by the sword, but by I think by the Muslim perspective, wouldn't be the correct way to describe it. It would have been more correctly described as a conquest of hearts. But Baha'u'llah says that this sovereignty has to be revealed and established either in the lifetime of every manifestation of God or after his ascension unto his true habitation in the realms above. What thou dost witness today in Islam is but a confirmation of this truth. That spiritual ascendancy, however, which is primarily intended, resideth within and revolveth around them from eternity even unto eternity. It can never for a moment be divorced from them. Its dominion hath encompassed all that is in heaven and on earth. And that can be seen as a direct continuation of the opening paragraph of part 2. And then he gives some evidences of the sovereignty exercised by Muhammad in paragraph 118, and continuing on with some more sort of examples of that. But then in paragraph 120, he sort of enters into a bit of a digression on the symbolic meaning of life and death and resurrection. And in particular, as with the idea of sovereignty, which one has to interpret in other than the obvious way, similarly, when scriptures talk about life and death, Baha'u'llah says one has to understand this in other than the obvious way. He says, whoever partook of the cup of love obtained his portion of the ocean of eternal grace and of the showers of everlasting mercy, and entered into the life of faith, the heavenly and everlasting life. But he that turneth away from that cup was condemned to eternal death. By the terms life and death spoken of in the scriptures is intended the life of faith and the death of unbelief. The generality of the people, owing to their failure to grasp the meaning of these words, rejected and despised the person of the manifestation, deprived themselves of the light of his divine guidance, and refused to follow the example of that immortal beauty. And Baha'u'llah gives an example of this in paragraph 121, when Muhammad promises that after death he shall surely be raised again. And the infidels will certainly exclaim, this is nothing but manifest sorcery, because if they understand life and death in the literal sense, and they see someone say die on the battlefield or whatever, then they won't believe if you say that they're raised to a new life. Again, he speaketh, if ever thou dost marvel, marvelous surely as they're saying, what, when we have become dust, shall we be restored in a new creation? Thus, in another passage, he wrathfully exclaimeth, are we wearied out with the first creation, yet are they in doubt with regard to a new creation? And then he goes into a kind of extended description of the grammatical meaning of a term, idha, in relation to the trumpet call, which we're gonna skip over for lack of time, because it's a detail on that we don't have time to get into. And then move on to because this takes a few paragraphs. And then we get on to paragraph 124, where it says that the people have always misunderstood the meaning of life and death and resurrection. He quotes the words of Jesus saying, "He must be born again, and except a man be born of water and of the Spirit, he cannot enter into the kingdom of God. That which is born of the flesh is flesh, and that which is born of the Spirit is spirit." And we hear, we're familiar, Christians quote those passages to this day. He says the purport of these words is that whosoever in every dispensation is born of the Spirit and is quickened by the breath of the manifestation of holiness, he verily is of those that have attained unto life and resurrection and have entered into the paradise of the love of God. And whoever is not of them is condemned to death and deprivation, to the fire of unbelief and to the wrath of God. Baha'u'llah is introducing to us in a similar way that he introduces the idea of sovereignty as having to mean something other than the literal worldly meaning of it. Also, when he talks about eternal life and when he talks about eternal death, when he talks about the meaning of these terms, he said one has to understand these in other than the obvious way. I think there are implications that maybe we can talk about at the end, about what we understand by the afterlife when we think of the afterlife as living again after one has physically died. But if, as Baha'u'llah describes it, true spiritual life is not, and true spiritual death are not necessarily correlated to our physical life and our physical death. It's possible to live the life of the Spirit while still living in this world. In other words, it's possible to be in that afterlife. What we think of as an afterlife, something that only happens after we physically died. It's possible to be living in that spiritual realm of the truly living while still living physically in this world. And conversely, it's possible to be physically living, but at the same time to be truly dead when it comes to the true spiritual meaning of death. Baha'u'llah has, as with sovereignty, he has disconnected for us the concept of true life and death from the physical life and death that we experience in the world. I think that has really interesting consequences, because the way I grew up thinking about afterlife was, well, the afterlife is the thing that you go on to after you die. I think that's almost a universal concept of the meaning of the term. You live once and then you die, and then your spirit goes on and has a separate life. But if Baha'u'llah has really disconnected for us, decoupled for us, the physical life and death from the spiritual life and death, then there's no reason to suppose that the end of one's physical life necessarily marks the beginning of one's spiritual life. That beginning of one's spiritual life can happen at any point along one's timeline, including in a way that overlaps with one's physical life. Anyway, maybe we could talk about that a little bit more. But he says more on this theme in paragraph 128. Oh, how strange and pitiful! Behold, all the people are imprisoned within the tomb of self, and lie buried beneath the nethermost depths of worldly desire. Wert thou to attain to but a dewdrop of the crystal waters of divine knowledge, thou wouldst readily realize that true life is not the life of the flesh, but the life of the spirit. For the life of the flesh is common to both men and animals, whereas the life of the spirit is possessed only by the pure in heart, who have quaffed from the ocean of faith and partaken of the fruit of certitude. This life knoweth no death, and this existence is crowned by immortality. Even as it hath been said, he who is a true believer liveth both in this world and in the world to come. If by life is meant this earthly life, it is evident that death must needs overtake it. What an incredible promise this is, that one doesn't have to wait to die to be fully alive in the life of the kingdom. As Baha'u'llah quotes, the true believer lives both in this world and the world to come. It's a kind of simultaneous existence. So he gives a further example of a verse of the Quran regarding Hamza, and then brings it up to the present day in paragraph 130. Thou dost witness today how, notwithstanding the radiant splendor of the sun of divine knowledge, all the people, whether high or low, have clung to the ways of those abject manifestations of the Prince of Darkness. Such is their way, and such will it remain forever. So Baha'u'llah is looking at bringing it up to the moment, and how all of these things are being repeated in relation to the revelation of the Bab. So that paragraph 130 then ends this digression on this question of life and death, which began with paragraph 120, and we return in paragraph 131. And it's nice that sometimes Baha'u'llah gives us these markers, like when he says to resume in paragraph 131, you know that that there's been some digression in the main thread of the argument, and it helps us reorient us to the main thread. So what he's returning to is this subject of spiritual sovereignty and its superiority to worldly sovereignty. So he says, our purpose in setting forth these truths has been to demonstrate the sovereignty of him who is the King of Kings. And he goes on to express and reaffirm the superiority of spiritual sovereignty to worldly dominion, and this is the topic of the next few paragraphs. In paragraph 133, he actually says worldly sovereignty in the sense that some imagine. He says is not even true of God. You know how some people imagine what sovereignty means, and crudely apply it to their prophet or to the imagined victory of their faith over all others. Baha'u'llah says, were it to imply the subjection and eternal allegiance of all the peoples and kindreds of the earth, he says, such form of sovereignty would not be true of God himself, the source of all dominion, whose majesty and power all things testify. For dost thou not witness how the generality of mankind is under the sway of his enemies? Have they not all turned away from the path of good pleasure? Have they not done that which he hath forbidden, and left undone? They repudiated and opposed those things which he hath commanded. This is, in a way, a recap of this whole problem of theodicy, of a world that ought to be, fully controlled by an all-powerful and benevolent deity who wants certain things to be done, but for some reason lets all the bad things be done. Somehow lets everyone disobey him. Somehow in paragraph 1 of part 2, even admits to the possibility of there being a prophet who comes with not a single person even to recognize him. I wonder, as a side point, if, and this is a speculation for which I find no confirmation in the writings, but I wonder if it's the case that there may have been prophets in the past that no one recognized. Perhaps it's the case because we know the number of prophets is not just the 9, corresponding to, say, the 9 religions that Baha'is like to say are the existing remnants of the religions of the past, but we know that there are infinite number of prophets. Are there prophets that were killed too soon? Are there prophets that no one recognized? Are there religions that could have become universal but failed by reason of the exigencies of the day? When we look at history, there's examples of some faiths that were nearly wiped out. Zoroastrianism is an example of a great religion of the Persian Empire, early Persian Empire, with its own body of scripture that was nearly extirpated, nearly erased by the victory of Islam many centuries later, and the attempted expurgation of all the traces of the Zoroastrian scriptures. Some remain, but those are not even the core scriptures. Could it be the case? And this is a revelation that Baha'is will recognize and acknowledge as being a divine revelation, which was nearly erased from the historical record as far as its scriptures are concerned, so that what remains are only the secondary works. Is it possible that other religions may have come and gone that were completely erased? I personally think that this is possible, but remains a matter of speculation. So Baha'u'llah continues then on this question of sovereignty, and concludes. It moves on to the example of Imam Hussein, paragraphs 135 to 140, which is a particular point of resonance for Shiite Muslims, for whom Imam Hussein was the specially chosen nephew, I believe, of Muhammad, and who was one of the imams in the Shiite reckoning of those who were rightly guided and those who were specifically intended by Muhammad to succeed him, whereas the Sunni Muslims don't recognize Imam Hussein in the same station as the Shiite Muslims, and so the station of Imam Hussein is a particular point of contention within the Muslim community itself. The Baha'i writings, and Baha'u'llah follows the Shiite version of the ascendancy of Imam Hussein, who died on the battlefield under dire circumstances, and so the question of the sovereignty of the prophets then extends to this question of the sovereignty, say, of Imam Hussein, also a rightly guided, in a sense, divinely sanctioned individual. How is it that he could have met the end that he had if he had this at least a ray of that utter sovereignty that the prophets possessed? And so Baha'u'llah deals with this question of Imam Hussein in paragraphs 135 to 140.
Stephen,
yes.
Can I ask a quick question, just sort of on this,
yes.
Circling around this idea of like, how can the prophets and the divinely inspired not evince the sovereignty that they're invested with spiritually? In paragraph 130, there's this reference, the first sentence alludes to a capitalized prince of darkness. In this context, I mean, we all know, in a way, we know that in the Baha'i cosmology, there is no embodiment of evil and the devil. But is there something that's being alluded to here in Islamic terms that may shed light on this? Or is it just kind of a reference to people following their own fancy as opposed to actually paying attention to seeing things with spiritual eyes?
I think that's what it is. Partly just because everywhere else that Baha'u'llah talks about, manifestations of Satan and so forth. Also at the top of page 123, you see manifestations of Satan with a capital S. It's often uppercased by Shoghi Effendi, and that uppercasing of it might lead us in English to think that a particular person is referred to, but Arabic and Persian don't have casing, and so that's a choice of translation. Another reason why I don't think that this is referring to a particular individual, I guess maybe not a great reason, but I would assume that there would be a footnote here in the Kitab-i-Iqan, which there isn't, that would link it to a certain historical individual. But then to do that, I have to appeal to Eshraq Khaveri, being rightly guided in the creation of these footnotes. But yeah, I think your suggestion is right, that this is talking about that kind of that ultimate manifestation of self and passion that that the people have always clung to from age to age.
Right. Thank you.
So we move then to the condition of the manifestations of the chosen ones. Paragraph 140 moves that maybe kind of summarizes his argument here. He says, "Know thou of a certainty that these luminaries of heavenly majesty, though their dwelling be in the dust, yet their true habitation is the seat of glory in the realms above. Though bereft of all earthly possessions, yet they soar in the realms of immeasurable riches. And whilst sore tried in the grip of the enemy, they are seated on the right hand of power and celestial dominion. Amidst the darkness of their abasement, there shineth upon them the light of unfading glory, and upon their helplessness are showered the tokens of an invincible sovereignty." And then he moves on to a discussion of Jesus, and there's a few paragraphs on Jesus and his sovereignty, despite also being bereft of physical possessions, physical power. And this takes us up through, I think, paragraph 1, several paragraphs. Along the way, he mentions the outward poverty of the companions of Imam Sadiq, and along the way, he also mentions what the true meaning of riches and poverty are. Just like life and death, just like sovereignty, poverty and riches also have spiritual meanings, which he mentions in paragraph 143. By riches is meant independence of all else but God, and by poverty is the lack of things that are of God.
Hey, Stephen, can I just say something real quick?
Yeah.
You've been bringing this up throughout the night, but I was really struck in this section how many times he said, "By this is meant this," and really there's kind of more work to be done in a way. Like, it would be a really interesting deepening to go through all of these, light, resurrection, death, day of judgment, riches, sun, moon, like the symbology that runs through all the religions that have been so misinterpreted by people, and to do a deeper excavation of these phrases and how they appear in the Quran and the Bible and the Baha'i writings to get to the bottom of it. It's really interesting, Baha'u'llah's definition and how different they are especially than Christian definitions, but so many definitions.
Yeah, we could make a list of these key terms that are all reinterpreted, and it'd be quite a long list of a few dozen terms, I think. So he says those denunciations, kind of summing up this whole section on sovereignty. He says those denunciations which were voiced in the past out of ignorance of the true meaning of sovereignty are are again, he says, occurring in this day. It is evident and known unto thee that those things to which the Jews and the Christians have clung, and the cavillings which they heaped upon the beauty of Muhammad, the same have in this day been upheld by the people of the Quran, and been witnessed in their denunciations of the point of the Bayan, the Bab. May the souls of all that dwell within the kingdom of divine revelations be a sacrifice unto him. So, so that ends this section on the sovereignty, and I'll just end with a couple of thoughts, basically recapping what we've already talked about, and then open it up. The first is that if we are going to reinterpret the sovereignty of the manifestations in non-literal terms, and if that's kind of really the theme of the Kitab-i-Iqan, is taking what was understood very literally and very rigidly and very sort of in its outward form, and exposing an inner meaning to it, and showing that these words all have double meanings, and that the less obvious meaning is usually the more correct meaning. If that's the case with the sovereignty of the manifestations and their undisputed sort of power over things, then would that not also have implications for other attributes that we assume that they have? And I'll throw this out also as maybe a controversial point, maybe not for people in this audience. When we talk about the prophets as being all-knowing, can we also interpret that in similar terms? Are they literally all-knowing? Do they literally have access to every single fact? Could they recite to us in Sanskrit the first Upanishad, having never studied Sanskrit? Could they, give Einstein's equations? If someone had bothered to ask a question about the nature of gravity, could they have written out the equation for it? Did they know it and they just didn't say for whatever reason? Or when we talk about the prophets being all-knowing, do we have something else in mind? Is there a spiritual meaning to knowledge and to the all-embracing nature of knowledge? For example, maybe in an outer sense, when we talk about knowledge in the sense of ilm, in the sense of book learning, things that you could learn from a book, maybe that's not what they have, just like maybe external sovereignty is not what they have. And we actually have a word for the true sovereignty or the true knowledge that they have, which is erfan. Erfan is the sort of direct recognition of the reality of things, which really goes beyond the power of words to express, which is far more all-embracing than ilm. But if we force ourselves to believe, and if we force others to somehow believe that they have access literally to all knowledge in the sense of ilm, are we making the same error of those who say, look, they also said they have sovereignty, but they don't have sovereignty. They were just killed. They were killed just like everyone else, and they, lived under these dire circumstances during their life. In other words, does this conversation and this thread of the argument that Baha'u'llah makes about sovereignty extend to other things? And does that, and in asking the question, maybe we don't have an answer to it, but in asking the question, does it help us not make the same errors that people of the past have made in thinking about their prophet in magical terms, thinking about their prophet as a kind of super being, walks on water, raises the dead? That's how Christians believe that in Christ, as having had these superpowers, healing the blind, raising the dead, and so forth. As Baha'is, we read these miracles of Christ and say, oh, well, those are all meant in spiritual terms, because these miracles didn't literally happen. But then when it comes to our prophet, are we making the same error when they say, oh, well, Baha'u'llah had access to all knowledge? Is that the same as Christians saying that Jesus had literally the power to raise the dead? So I'll leave that as an open question. I'll also just underline a point which we're going to see in deeper, Baha'u'llah go even deeper into when it comes to how he describes the divine and its relationship to the world. And we saw already him describing at least three different degrees of it, that there's a God in the sort of realm of utter transcendence. There's a God that becomes revealed through the mouthpiece of a prophet. And then there's a God which is manifest within all things. It's not three different gods, obviously, but it's three different ways of interacting with the divine. One of them, we could say, corresponds roughly to the theological position of deism, a God that exists but is not interacting with the world actively. The second, the God that reveals himself through prophets, aligns more closely with our idea of historical theism, a God that reveals books from age to age. Whereas the third, this God that is manifest within every atom, an all-pervasive divine light that's found within all things, corresponds more directly to theologically what we would call pantheism. And I mention this because Baha'u'llah was asked about this more explicitly from one of his Zoroastrian friends, Manakji Sahib, sometime in the 1870s, who asked Baha'u'llah to say, what is the correct way of understanding how God interacts with the world? And Manakji Sahib gave Baha'u'llah this idea of 4 different schools of thought and asked Baha'u'llah to say, which of these is the correct school of thought? And 3 of those schools of thought correspond quite neatly to these 3 different degrees of the divine that we see here in the Kitab-i-Iqan. The 4th school of thought was agnosticism or atheism, that talk of God is kind of irrelevant. And the really interesting that Baha'u'llah does in his tablet to Manakji Sahib, which he does explicitly there, and I think more implicitly here in the Kitab-i-Iqan, is that Baha'u'llah is not saying there is one correct way to understand God. There isn't one correct way, one correct theological formulation. But Baha'u'llah is giving us these different avenues to understanding the divine. Within one avenue, we see the divine everywhere. Within another avenue, God is so far beyond everything we can't even say anything at all. And within the third avenue, God is right here, manifest in the flesh, in the person of the prophet that has a historical existence, who had a life and a death, who is a focal point of our prayers, literally, to whom we literally turn to in prayer and so forth. Baha'u'llah is giving us all these different pathways to relating to a divine, and he's not forcing us to choose one of them. In a way, he's saying this pathway of the divine, which is through a mouthpiece of a prophet, has a kind of immediacy and necessity according to the exigencies of the day, because that's what's going to bring humanity together under one umbrella. But he doesn't. It's not a kind of exclusive way of understanding the divine. And finally, I wanted to again mention this fascinating discussion about life and death, about spiritual life and death that Baha'u'llah introduces here, and which we could actually have a whole deepening sequence on by itself, because there's the Baha'i writings have such a rich, are so rich in their description of this spiritual life, spiritual death, the afterlife, immortality of the soul, and so forth. And the direction that Baha'u'llah, to me, seems to be introducing here is a direction which decouples the concept of afterlife from the concept of something that necessarily happens after one's death. It seems to me that Baha'u'llah is describing the spiritual life that is enjoyed by both the physical living and the physical dead as something which is something that one can obviously begin to experience before one actually crosses that physical threshold. So, and I'll just finally end with this thought that of building up a list in the interest along the theme of building lists. This is one list that I started to build. Maybe I should also have started building a list of metaphorical terms that are reinterpreted. But I'm building this list to try to get a sense of a summary of what Baha'u'llah is doing in reconfiguring our conception of religion. What is happening in the Kitab-i-Iqan is a recasting of certain ground level theological concepts, at least as expressed in the more strongly expressed in the Western Abrahamic traditions. And Baha'u'llah is giving us another, he's sometimes flipping these on their head, and or sometimes just giving us another equivalent angle of approach to them. For example, he's taking what say in the past was a more literal reading of things, and he's inviting us into a more metaphorical or symbolic reading. He's taking what in the past was a great emphasis on authority, especially clerical authority, and replacing it with something like individual responsibility, individual spiritual responsibility for investigation of reality, which we can also correlate to the historical movement in the West over the last few centuries of the Enlightenment, the birth of reason in Western civilization, the scientific revolution, all of which are expressions, I think, in history formally disconnected from any particular religious revelation. But I think allied to it is this birth of reason and the birth of the individual that we've seen in Western culture over the last few centuries. And we see the spiritual correlate of that here in the Kitab-i-Iqan. We've seen an autocratic principle being replaced, although not so much explicitly here, but later on in Kitab-i-Aqdas and in other works, with a more democratic principle. We're seeing the idea of there being one true doctrine that everyone has to assent to, very much the sort of the thrust of the Old Testament. You know, there is this correct way of believing in God, and everything else is idolatry. Very much the focus also of the Quran. We see that being replaced so crucially with a much more multivariate, much more polyvalent way of thinking about the divine, which validates multiple standpoints, which one might consider to be logically contradictory to each other. And Baha'u'llah is not concerned with the logical contradiction of theology A and theology B. He gives each their due and wants to validate each of them. We move also from the idea of there being one single chosen people, and that opens up to all the tribes of humanity. And that particular message becomes far more explicit later on in Baha'u'llah's ministry in the Aqqa period. We see this artificial distinction, faith or reason. The Christian theologian Tertullian asks, what has Athens to do with Jerusalem? The implicit answer being nothing. You know, the two are separate from each other, but Baha'u'llah is asking us to consider faith and reason, not faith or reason. And finally, we're moving from a conception of religion dominated by a kind of coercion of the clergy, coercion of there being only one right way of doing things. And we see that opened up into a conception of religion which is more dominated by persuasion, something which attracts rather than compels, something which through the magnetic force of love invites people in rather than pushes people in through any kind of force or threat. All of these I see as signalizing the fundamental transformations in religion and in religious practice that Baha'u'llah is asking as exigencies of the day, as exigencies of this day, in order to solve this terrible problem of disunity that the world is afflicted with. So that's it for my notes for this week.